With the release of Shadow of the Erdtree looming directly in front of us, for me personally, it should release tomorrow around 3 o'clock my time. I'm getting more and more excited. I've been working to prepare my character for the appropriate level so that I can jump right in after it gets downloaded. And I wanted to talk through some of the things that I personally am excited for and hope that we get to see in the DLC. Now, there were a number of things that have already been confirmed by FromSoft, which means at this point I'm just speculating for the fun of speculating, and I hope you enjoy as well. Before I jump into my speculation and hopes for it, I wanted to quickly talk about how I accidentally ended up getting Elden Ring. So, back in 2020, a game was announced called Avowed, and I watched the trailer for it and I was mesmerized. I was incredibly excited and really wanted to get this game. However, somehow in my brain, I completely forgot the name of this game. And then I heard that Elden Ring was to be announced within a couple of months, I believe at the time, and I was like, oh, there's the game I've been waiting for. So I went ahead and just purchased it and then preloaded it and started playing it. And I didn't realize for about a week that I had bought the wrong game. However, I fell in love with the game and I played it for like 2 months straight, so it kind of made up for it. But it was just super funny because I don't know whether or not I would have bought the game ahead of time like I did had I not realized that it was the wrong game. Looking at some of the things I'm hoping to see inside of Shadow of the Erdtree are, I want to see more interesting bosses and enemies. Now, what I've heard as sentiment from the Souls community is that the DLC is usually where it hits. It's where the harder bosses are, it's usually the harder part of the game, it's where they spend a lot of time and energy into, and from what FromSoft has shared with us, I can believe it. I'm really hoping to see bosses that are as complex and difficult, maybe better fine-tuned, but in the same vein as something like Malenia, who can regenerate upon hitting her enemies and has this really difficult phase too. I think that more fine-tuning would have made her fight more enjoyable, but I still think her fight was super fun, and it took me a while to beat her. Also something like Rykard, which is a very unique boss. It's very much a one-off boss where you actually get a specialty weapon to fight this monster, and without it, it is significantly more difficult. Even with it, it's a cool boss fight with a lot of different mechanics. Or something like Elden Beast. I actually really didn't like Elden Beast the first time I fought it, but the last 2 times that I've beaten the game, I had a greater appreciation for the boss. I feel like it takes a lot of what you have been taught throughout the game, and it sort of diversifies it while you're fighting first Radagon and then Elden Beast after you beat Radagon. I would like the bosses to have a wider variety of resistances that we as a player have to think about, as opposed to just holy. It's not that they only have holy resistance, but it was like every single boss, at least if I'm remembering correctly, had holy resistance. And I think a greater variety of resistances and weaknesses would be more interesting. I also hope that if there are more dragons, which I hope there are more dragons, the art style and attacks are a little bit more varied. I felt like a lot of the dragons were mostly repeat enemies, or I just didn't really vibe well with their general theme. A good example is Farum Azula. A lot of the dragons there were the same dragon over and over, but even when they weren't, I didn't really like the gimmick. Maybe that was just me personally. I did, however, like the secret dragon boss, the dragon boss of time. I thought that was a fantastic fight, and I'd love to see something similar. On that note, I'm hoping they don't reuse too many bosses from the base game. The base game had a lot of reused bosses, and I gave it grace because I enjoyed a lot of the setup and build-up, even if the bosses weren't always that interesting because I felt like I'd beaten them before. But I would like to see new original bosses in the DLC. If they reuse some of the base game bosses, I would prefer that they adjust them so that they feel a little bit more fresh. Additionally, one of my biggest letdowns personally was the undead boat bosses. I felt they had a lot of potential, but they were ultimately super easy to kill. They didn't have a lot of variety. I think they had like 2 or 3 variants total, despite fighting them like 6 or 7 times. And they were never really challenging in my opinion. They were incredibly easy to beat, and I'm hoping that they bring them back into the DLC and they make them more interesting. I'd also really like some new mechanics that we as players either get to take hold of or have to deal with. I don't really know exactly what I'm describing. I don't really have a good example offhand, but it would be really cool if going into the DLC, there was something that just sort of shook things up a little bit. One way that they could do this is a different focus when it comes to combat. So in Dark Souls 3, which was the other Dark Souls, or the other FromSoft game I've beaten, it wasn't nearly as much about opponents trying to fake you out. While that was an aspect, it wasn't the central theme within combat. Whereas in Elden Ring, it is the central theme. And because of that, certain bosses, I know to just hit them like 6 times because they're going to spend 7 seconds pretending to hit me before they go wild. That was fine for the base game. I'm hoping that they adjust that and they do a different focus for combat and things that you have to worry about and deal with. I also noticed that in the base game, 2s was a big deal. They had a lot of double bosses. And if they're going to do that again, I'm totally for it. I just hope that the bosses have more synergy. I don't feel like a lot of the double bosses that they had in Elden Ring really hit as well as something like Bernstein and Smo from, I believe, Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2. Or the gargoyles from Dark Souls 1, which I did fight and they were super cool. Something else that I think would be awesome to bring into the DLC, which they kind of have already, they do have in the base game, would be more horse-based combat. A good example being Fire Giant. A lot of people thought that the Fire Giant was the best boss in the game, either that or Malekith, and I fully agree. I thought that the Fire Giant was such an epic fight. It had an interesting mechanic in regards to the Fire Giant, but it heavily utilized horse-based mechanics, which I found fun. Something else I think would be cool is some new unique summons. I know that some people are opposed to summons and all of that. I'm not one of those people. I like summons. It's how I beat the game the first time. The second time I didn't really use them, and the third time I didn't use them at all. But I found that they were super fun to use, and now that I'm trying to level a character up, I find them super helpful to kind of blitz through the game. Now, I feel that this section is a little bit of a guarantee, but I'm hoping that they continue the beautiful aesthetics and the beautiful scenery that they've set up from the base game. Base game environments were extraordinary, which is a high bar for the DLC to have to compete with. That said, I have done the DLC in Dark Souls 3, and I can say that I'm pretty sure they're going to do it. I know they can do it. I'm hoping for continued environment variety, such as Caelid, which is this reddish darker location, but then you've got Starfall Crater, which is this beautiful blue environment with these ant enemies, and then you've got Farum Azula, which is also an amazing environment. So I'm really hoping that they keep with the theme and have these beautiful, wonderful places to explore with things around every nook and cranny. I also hope that they have continued variety of NPCs, where they have different endings and interesting stories, interesting loot, different endings depending on which NPCs you do. I think that would be really cool. I don't know how they would tie that into a story, but if anyone can do it, I know FromSoft can. One of my favorite aspects about Elden Ring is just the large variety of gear, where even though there's a lot of gear that can feel similar, there's a lot of gear that just really stands out. And I'm hoping that they continue this trend to give a lot of really cool weapons with different arts, different damages, different types. I'm excited and hopeful of that. It's one of my favorite parts of the base game. With that said, I'm also hoping for more fashion souls. I'm hoping that some of the better gear isn't the ugly gear, because a lot of the best gear I find is usually the ugly gear, and I know that I could probably get away without it, but in my last build, I did a sort of barbarian idiot strength build, and it had the most horrendous looking gear to get my poise up as high as possible. And I'm hoping they have more beautiful gear that can accomplish similar things. The last thing I'm hoping for, which I don't know that they'll do because it doesn't seem to be the focus of the game, and that's okay, but I would love to have gear for my horse. I would love to do fashion souls, but for my horse. Even if there's no stat differences, although that would be cool too, I would really just like to be able to make my horse more individual and run around feeling like an actual knight on a plated horse or a diamonded, horse or whatever. I think that would be really cool. With that said, that was pretty much what I was hoping for. I mean, we'll see tomorrow. I'm going to be playing the bejesus out of this game, and I hope that everyone else here gets the chance to play it and enjoy it too. Let me know if there's anything that you were excited for or hope to see in the game. Have a great rest of your day, and stay safe, Wildlanders.